Once upon a time, there was a beautiful place called Iberia, where everyone was Christian and life was wonderful. Just across the Strait of Gibraltar lived the evil Moors, who had recently accepted Islam as their religion. In 711, fueled by the newly found religious fervor, these Moorish infidels crossed into Iberia and started a war with the Christians. Within a few years, they successfully overtook most of Iberia, spreading their religion and political dominance. Only a small enclave in the north escaped their evil rule. To make things worse, during the long reign of the Muslims, other non-Christians made their way into the land, the Jews. The Christians could tolerate it no longer. The land was being flooded with non-believers, so, calling on St. James the Moor Killer for his blessing, the Christians slowly reconquered the lands from Moorish rule. It took about 700 years, but finally, in 1492, the Catholic kings Ferdinand and Isabella finally expelled all of the Muslims and Jews from the land, and the country returned to its previous wonderful all-Christian bliss. This is a nice fairy tale, but it is wrong. Let's look at this from a more realistic point of view. Before the Moors attacked, Iberia was governed by the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe that considered themselves Romans version 2. They adopted Latin-type law and the Latin language. As far as religion is concerned, at first they persecuted the Christians, then converted to Christianity themselves, a la Constantine. In the 7th century, their religious intolerance shifted to the Jews, who were given a choice to leave or convert, become slaves, or be killed. Under these circumstances, about 80,000 Jews converted. This is a theme in Spanish history. Religious minorities were either forced to convert, were killed or enslaved, or were forced to flee. As far as governance is concerned, the Visigoths were nowhere as good as their predecessors, the Romans. In their 200-year rule, the Visigoths were ruled by 30 different kings, an average of 6 years per reign. Many came to power as a result of coups and assassinations. Their rule was one of constant power struggles, political corruption, and financial crisis. When 12,000 Moors crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in the south, the Visigothic king Roderick and his men were soundly whooped by the Moorish leader Tariq and his men. In what would become a tradition carried on for many years in Iberia, intermarriage began. For example, Roderick's widow ended up marrying Tariq's son. Most of the peninsula fell to the Moors in a few short years, and Moorish men began taking wives from among the local populations. While many of the conquered peoples converted to Islam, Christianity and Judaism were still practiced. In the ensuing years, Arabic was adopted by many, while the Latin spoken in Iberia began its evolution into the Iberian Romance languages, with a great deal of Arabic influence. For the common man, however, the Moorish invasion didn't change life much. It was a mere exchange of a Visigothic overlord for a Moorish one. Many landowners were able to keep their land as long as they paid homage to their new Moorish governors. According to the Quran, non-Muslims have to pay an extra tax as well, so avoiding taxes was another reason many converted to Islam. The Jews, for their part, were ecstatic to get rid of the Visigoths, who had treated them so miserably. Freed from religious persecution under the Visigoths, the Jews flourished for a time. They founded a Talmudic school in Cordoba and often served as neutral diplomats between Moors and Christians. However, under Islamic law, Jews were considered inferior. In the centuries that followed, Jews were often the victims of mob attacks by Muslims, resulting in the destruction of their homes and their property. In 722, a group of Visigothic Christians, led by Pelayo, was attacked by the Moors. Most of the Christians were killed, but small groups escaped by hiding in caves. This skirmish was billed as the first Christian victory, and so began the Christian reconquest of the peninsula. Over time, Christian kingdoms formed in the north and slowly gained ground, pushing southward. The Christians would go into battle calling on St. James the Moor Killer to favor them with victory. And of course, with victory comes land, the spoils of war. The whole reconquest, supposedly carried out to make the land Christian, was in reality, a massive land grab, using God to justify it. A clear example of taking the Lord's name in vain, or in other words, misusing his name for unholy purposes. One thing to keep in mind is that these wars and border extensions weren't always Christians against Moors. Christian kingdoms also warred among themselves, and often the Christian kingdom would ally with a Moorish taifa to fight against another Christian kingdom. Moorish Iberia was not a bastion of peace either, with taifas fighting between each other for power and land. But things weren't always terrible. Moorish Iberia was marked with periods of religious tolerance. For example, the Church of St. Vincent of Saragossa was used for both Islamic and Christian services for 50 years. However, in 1148, a new wave of more religiously radical Moors swept through the peninsula, the Almohads. Forget religious tolerance. They continued the oft-repeated tradition in Iberia. They demanded conversion to Islam, death, or exile. Many converted while others fled to the Christian kingdoms of the north. By 1492, the Moors had been pushed southward by years of wars. In that year, the Catholic kings Ferdinand and Isabella captured the last Moorish kingdom of Granada and kicked the Jews and Moors out of the peninsula. But what did that entail? They exacted the same thing from the Muslims and Jews that the Muslims and Visigoths had: death, forced conversion, or exile. It's estimated that 175,000 Jews and about 3 million Muslims left Spain. Those who were forcibly converted immediately became suspects. After all, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still, right? As far as the new converts were concerned, they were never on equal footing with the old Christians. The doctrine of purity of blood stated that Muslim and Jewish blood was tainted, which allowed these converts to be legally and socially marginalized. What's more, something you didn't expect happened. The Spanish Inquisition was established to hunt down converts who they thought were not truly converted in their hearts. Torture was often their modus operandi. The Inquisition killed about 30,000 to 300,000 people until they were dismantled. In 1609, the Spanish crown could no longer tolerate these suspicious converts, and they too were expelled. On a side note, it's interesting that pork is the most commonly eaten meat in Spain. Could it have gained this status because of the Jewish and Muslim converts? That is, one way of supposedly proving that you were a real convert was to eat pork, which was forbidden by Islam, forbidden by Judaism, but accepted by the Christian faith. So who exactly were these people who were being expelled? They weren't newly arrived immigrants, but people whose home was Spain, people whose grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and so on had been born and raised in the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. One mistaken idea is that the expulsion was ethnic. Of course, there were those who had only Jewish or Moorish ancestors, but given the long history of intermarriage and forced or coerced conversion to Islam or to Christianity, the people who were being expelled were ethnically mixed. They were a combination of all the inhabitants of Iberia, including the Romans, the Celts, the Iberians, the Germanic tribes, the Jews, and the Moors. It's worth noting that about 20% of present-day Spaniards have Jewish blood, and 11% have Moorish blood. So what was the outcome of the expulsion of all these people? Well, the crown gave them 4 months to sell their possessions, and suddenly the market was flooded with property and belongings for sale, resulting in mass devaluation of their value. Christians considered banking and money lending to be dealing with filthy lucre. They didn't want to touch it, which is why much of society's financial dealings were done by Jews, whose financial skills, by the way, were expelled along with them. Those being expelled could not collect money from their creditors, nor could they pay the loans they owed. Thousands of laborers, artisans, merchants, doctors, and scholars all left Spain, all of which sent the Spanish economy into a nosedive. Many fled to North Africa. Others settled in the Ottoman Empire, where they were accepted with open arms. King Bayezid, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, remarked in astonishment, "Do they call this Ferdinand a politic prince who can thus impoverish his own kingdom and enrich ours? The Spanish reconquest fulfilled its goal of taking all lands from non-Christians and making Spain monotheistic. However, the country paid a high social and economic toll as a result, something the United States should take note of as many push for the mass expulsion of people who are an essential part of the economy.